All right. So with the window, when we look at the window really quickly and we look at what would be like step one over here, at least step one for painting, we see that we have the window and we have a shadowed area and this light painting. Do you guys think that we can do that all in one shot? See a couple heads shaking no. We can't, because if we try to paint two tones of brown over here and they're both wet, they're going to leak into each other. They're going to look sort of, I guess, bled and fuzzy. So this is actually like step one and step two. So the first thing we're going to do, I'm going to set up to paint my window, is get my brown paint, and I'm going to work mostly this time with the flat brush. And to working with the flat brush, what I want to do is I want to mix a light value. On the sheet of windows, you'll see there's a whole value scale here. We're trying to mix something down here, pretty light, all right? So what we want to do for pretty light is we want to have, you know, a lot of water and just a little bit of paint. So since we can kind of use this a few times, it's okay to put like 3, 4, even 5 drops in there. Not even halfway full, but a little bit more water than we're used to. I'll take a little bit of paint, and this is how we control how dark we make it. And what I'll do is I'll mix that up first. It's impossible to know how dark it is by looking at it. So I'll dip and wipe, and I'll just test it in the bottom corner. Bottom corner, it's really light, so I'm just going to make it just a little bit darker. Add just a little bit more paint to it. Mix it up thoroughly. And if you don't mix it thoroughly, you'll see those little streaks of paint in it. Dip and wipe, and I'll see, yeah, it's a little bit darker. So for my window to get started, I am only doing one tone of gray right now. So for the beginning part, just get this out of the way, I can kind of come in and do the top part of this thing all with like a little bit of a shadow. All right. You want to kind of have the brush dry enough that it works like a marker. I'm going to dip and wipe. I'm going to go ahead and do the sort of frame around the window. And again, this should all be done with your flat brush. Gotta get those good clean edges. I'll paint that inside pane of the window. I'm going to try to keep some of it, a little edge over there, a little bit white, so it has that sort of like, I guess, edge of the frame that's kind of catching the light in a different way. So I'm going to leave a little bit of that, a little white, dip and wipe. I'm going to leave that sort of bar in between the window and the top part. I'm going to leave that white. Go ahead and paint that. That's how I see it in the picture. There's a little color over there. I'm going to go ahead and take my flat brush and use that to make my little slats on the siding on the house. Old side of wooden siding. And dip and wipe. I will make the shadow underneath the flower box. More of those, and then when I get to the flower box itself where I have the actual flowers, since the flowers are an organic shape, I'm going to switch over to my round brush. I'll use the same wash. I'll dip and wipe, and you know, for the flower box, we just want to create a little depth, and we're going to like add more and more dark elements to this like sort of leafy area as we work. So what I'm going to do is just, I'm going to make some random sort of marks. I'm going to leave some spots white, and just go ahead and create a couple of these random leafy kind of marks. Okay, so step one for my window is good. All right, I don't want to go ahead and mix a darker value and start painting. I want to give it a chance to kind of sink in the paper and dry. With this sort of winter weather and the dryness in the air, it'll dry up pretty quickly. So while it's drying, I'm going to use that same wash. I'm going to turn my paper over, and I'm going to take a look at the mountain. When I look at the mountain in stage one, you're going to see that almost all of it has a little bit of light brown on it. except really the face of the mountain that the sun's kind of hitting. You can see some textural lines here, but everything else is pretty much a very, very light brown. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up with that. Just looking really quickly at my first wash here, what I'll do is I'll just put a couple more drops of water in here just to kind of lighten it up. I'll mix, mix, mix. I'm going to use my flat brush to start painting the mountain. I know I said we were using flat brushes for more geometric stuff and the round brushes for more organic stuff, and the mountain's definitely organic. But in this case, when I want to cover large areas, I'm going to use the flat brush. And generally when we do our actual landscape painting, when you're painting your sky, you're usually going to use the flat brush to cover large areas and then come back later with the round brush to make things like clouds. So I'm going to go ahead and paint that all, and the reason why we're working like this is it gives us the opportunity to let the rest of the painting sort of settle down for the window, dry up and soak up into the paper. And again, if you work on one part of a watercolor painting for too long and it's too wet, ultimately what happens is the paper, as some of you see, paper starts getting really, really roughed up. And since we're going to be doing a bigger painting, there are going to be different areas of your painting that you can focus on at a given time. So you may work a little bit on one part, leave that alone, and then work on a different area and let the other part dry before you go back into it. That way the paper holds up together, doesn't get wrecked, and then we have the opportunity to kind of keep working for this particular practice. And I'll go ahead and everything down here in this foreground is going to get painted. So I've left a little bit of that white face of the mountain, that sort of sheer face that's kind of like for climbing, I guess. I'm going to take my round brush. I'm going to use my round brush, and I'm going to dip and wipe, and I'm going to add just some of those little blotches here to kind of create some of the jagged little features that are in there. So I use the flat brush to cover large areas. I'm using my round brush for the sort of like random little organic little marks. And again, this is done with my lightest value, and I've gotten basically my first level of the mountain done. I want to let that dry. So while that's drying, I'm going to go ahead and switch back to my window. I'm going to go back to my window, and like I said before, the window itself, step one is kind of like two steps. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to go back in. It's not dramatically darker. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to dip my flat brush into that light wash. Even though that wash is pretty light, because I'm layering it on top of something that had already been painted, it should come out a little bit darker. So painting the shadow that's going to be on my top of my window, I can go ahead and do that. I can go ahead and make those slightly darker slats on my shingles. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and go in here and kind of darken up the window just a little bit so that my actual windows get a little bit darker. And again, I didn't even really make the wash any darker. I'm just kind of going over a second time on an area that's dry. And you'll find that with if you let it dry and you go over it, you can always, again, make things darker. I'm going to go ahead and finish that. All right. Now I'm going to take this, I'm going to put it to the side, and I'm going to go back to my mountain. I'm going to go to my second part of my mountain. And when I go to the second part of my mountain, you're going to see in the photograph that we have a little bit more darkness. All right. We have some of the little bigger elements like this hill and mountain that's over here on the sides. They've gotten a little bit darker. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my wash. I'm going to put just a little bit more paint into it. I don't want to make it super dark, but I do want to have a noticeable difference. I'm going to go ahead and mix that up, adding a little bit more paint to it. I know the side part's going to be a little bit darker, so I'm going to test it out. Yeah, that looks pretty good. If it was too light, I would add a little bit more paint. If it was too dark, I would go ahead and add a little bit more water. So since that's a big area, I'm going to go ahead and use that flat brush to kind of fill that in. I want to use the flat brush so it covers a lot of area in a quick little bit of time. I'm going to go ahead and this little mountain feature that's out in the front, go ahead and use the flat brush for that as well. Dip and wipe, and side of the mountain, a little bit on the opposite side of the mountain, I'm going to go ahead and fill that in. Again, I'm going to switch now to my round brush, dip again into that slightly darker wash that I made, and I'm going to go ahead and try to get a little bit of that texture that you see on some parts of the mountain. Over here it's a little bit sort of uneven, got a little bit of cracks and crevices, things like that. And the mountain, it's a random occurrence in nature, so we don't have to make everything like exactly perfect. You can probably change your marks up a little bit. It's still going to look kind of like a mountain. Shouldn't be able to change it too dramatically. And take your time and add a few more of those little elements in here. While you're doing that, obviously the window is drying on us, which is good, so we can come back with an even darker value. I'll go ahead, and I feel like I've kind of added enough to my little mountain range. Now I'm going to let the mountain dry. I'm going to come back to my window. I'm off of step 1 and step 2 over here. I want to go switch over now to step basically 3. Step 3 is, we can see the window part gets a bit darker. We have a couple darker marks here on the shingles, and I start to add a little more texture in my flower bed. So I'm going to take a little bit more paint. I'm going to take a little bit more paint and add it into my wash, making my wash a little bit darker. Not the darkest I can make it, but darker. I'm going to dip and wipe. I'm going to just test it out really quick here. I feel pretty good about that. So I'm going to go ahead and use that darker value now to kind of get in there and paint the window a little bit darker. Dip and wipe. Use that to paint the triangle part of the window a little bit darker. Paint the slats up here, maybe just one touch a little bit darker. And now I think what I'll do is I'll switch over to my round brush, because I'm going to do the flower box. I'm going to dip, wipe, and then I'm not going to cover up everything that I did in the flower box, but I'm going to make a few more sort of like little leafy, organic little marks going in all different kinds of directions to make a little bit more texture in that little flower box. All right, so I've got now this third kind of step done. While that's drying, I'll turn that over, put it to the side, and I'm going to go to my little last area on the mountain here. I'm going to take a look at the mountain. I'm going to see that we've got a little bit more texture, darker texture in here, a couple more levels of texture and throughout, a few more marks throughout there. I think I could use a little bit more on my own. So I'm going to go ahead with my round brush now that I have all these like random marks to make. I got a slightly darker wash already, so I'm going to dip and wipe. And then I'm just going to kind of go through and sort of add a little bit of that irregularity to this little mound in the front. You don't have to copy every brush stroke exactly, but what we want to do is kind of break it up and give it a little bit more sort of natural randomness. Little marks here and there. Again, you can kind of make your own up. Add some structure back into striations in the rocks. Randomness, a little bit of change up over here on the old little smaller mountain that's kind of peeking out in front. Got all of that. And then what I want to do is I want to kind of do this sort of rolling hill in the front. It's supposed to look like a silhouette, and with that silhouette, you kind of see that it's sort of like a tree line, or it's supposed to be like a uneven tree line. What I can do is, now that I'm working on my darkest part, is really go in and, just like we did for the tree trunks and stuff like that, really just use a lot of paint that's concentrated with not too much water. So when I do that, I'll dip in with my darker color, and I'll start with my tree line. And this is, again, I'm using the paint a little bit more concentrated, like I was using it for doing the tree trunk, when we did the palm tree, and when we did the sort of winter tree. And then what I'll do is I'll use a bit more of that to kind of get a bunch of this filled in, and to kind of keep up with that sort of texture of a forest down there. I'm going to kind of just fill this thing up a little bit with some random marks. And get the start of that tree line going, and then I can use my big flat brush to kind of fill out the rest of that. I've got my tree lines out in the front. Can always kind of add more marks here and there if I want to the mountain. And then I've got my mountain range pretty much done with my tree lines in it. I can go back now to my window. I'm really on the last stage of my window. Yeah, she's absent.
Thank you.
I'll go back to my last stage of my window. Last stage of my window. I've done one more dark level of color in there. It's kind of separated so you can see almost like the hint of another window in the background. I could probably use a little bit more paint on my palette. So my version here is going to be a little bit lighter than it needs to be, but if I was doing this for real, I would go ahead and squeeze out a little bit more paint. I would paint that frame of the other window in there, fill in my window for one last time, make it nice and dark. I will go ahead and add one more layer of kind of like darkness to my vegetation. I'm going to dip and wipe, and then come in here and do some more little like leaves and little textural pieces over here to kind of add a little bit more depth to my planter. With little flowers, give it the feel of like things are just kind of growing randomly out of that. Again, all of this is just practicing with the brushes and getting comfortable with each one. The biggest thing I want you to understand in doing these things is you want to let each layer dry before you start painting on top of it. It's important that you don't just work just on the window and then just work on the window until it's finished and then just work on the mountain. This way you can be efficient and give it enough time to dry. You want to think that you're going to have at least 3 or 4 layers of color. Each time you're going back to your wash and making it a little bit darker. And you want to think logically that when you're painting organic pieces like vegetation, like cracks in the mountain, you use the round brush. And when you're painting large areas or geometric shapes, you're using the flat brush. So once you have that done, I would tell you honestly, if you started today with a couple washes, you probably can finish both by tomorrow, the end of class, give or take that or another period. When you're done with that, of course, we'll peel it off carefully, we'll photograph it, and that will be submitted as a separate assignment. I'll put something up for it. And with that, then we're going to go towards doing a little bit more complicated of a sunset, and you guys are going to choose your own landscapes later on to paint. Well, that is the mountain and the window.